Hey everyone, let's jump right into episode 2 of our explainer series, The Fascist PPP, Totalitarian Corporatism and the Vending Machine Illusion. Today, we're going to unpack a massive historical paradox about how the economic systems of 1930s fascist Italy and Nazi Germany actually worked. You know, when we think of totalitarian regimes, we usually picture the state owning absolutely everything. But if you look closely at the data from the 1930s, we see something completely counterintuitive. These regimes actually heavily utilized private property, business guilds, and public-private partnerships. So it raises a really fascinating question, right? How on earth did regimes that ruthlessly crushed individual liberty and democratic institutions seemingly promote private property, independent business owners, and labor guilds? Were they secretly champions of the free market, or was something much more deceptive going on? Here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. The fascist economic paradox. 2. Mussolini's corporative state. 3. The illusion of autonomy. 4. Nazi Germany's reprivatization. 5. Control without ownership. And 6. The vending machine illusion. All right, let's get into it. Section 1. The fascist economic paradox. To set the global economic stage, you have to remember the 1930s was the era of the Great Depression. It was a time of unprecedented financial panic, and governments worldwide were just scrambling to stabilize their economies. Just look at the stark contrast happening globally at that time. Over in Western democracies, the instinct for survival meant increased state ownership. Countries were frantically nationalizing industries just to keep them afloat. But if we look at the fascist regimes in Italy and Germany, they moved in the exact opposite direction. They were pushing models based on corporate guilds and actually reprivatizing state-owned assets. It completely defied the mainstream economic trends of the era. Section 2. Mussolini's corporative state. Let's head over to Italy first and examine what Benito Mussolini proposed as a third way to resolve the crisis of the liberal state. Okay, let's clear up this definition right out of the gate. Today, when we hear corporatism, we almost always think of a corporatocracy. You know, a system ruled by giant modern business conglomerates. But back in the 1930s, Italian corporativismo meant something quite different. It was developed as a direct response to classical liberalism and Marxism, and it advocated for cooperation between classes. The idea was to organize society into corporate groups or industrial guilds. It was supposed to bring employers, workers, and state officials together at the national level to manage the economy collectively. On paper, it promised to recognize and harmonize every divergent interest. Sounded pretty good, right? But well, here is exactly where that nice theoretical promise crashes into totalitarian reality. Despite all the grand talk of guild autonomy and class harmony, Mussolini's ultimate guiding principle for Italian fascism was this: everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. As we're going to see, any autonomy granted to these groups was strictly, and I mean strictly, conditional. Section 3. The illusion of autonomy. Let's look at how this transition from theory to practice reveals the deep deception at the very heart of the Italian system. The big promise was that these trade unions and guilds would have self-regulatory independence, a true public-private partnership. But the reality? Utter top-down state absorption. Spontaneous social formations were denied any legal recognition whatsoever. The state basically became a demiurgic power, totally depotentiating these social organizations. They had absolutely zero real regulatory independence. They were just hollow extensions of the bureaucratic state. So the real takeaway here is this absolutely was not true private enterprise or worker empowerment. I mean, look at the actual data. The 1927 Labor Charter officially banned strikes. Workers literally could not take economic action. Meanwhile, there was this massive revolving door between government civil service and private business. It basically became a system of staggering corporate welfare. When businesses failed during the Depression, the state, meaning the everyday taxpayer, absorbed all the losses, while profits remained strictly private. Through state rescues, by 1939, Mussolini's government controlled 20% of the Italian industry through entities like the IRI. It was collaboration, for sure, but heavily manipulated to benefit the state and its closest industrial allies. Moving on to Section 4, Nazi Germany's reprivatization. Let's jump over to 1930s Germany and see how this builds into an entirely different, yet equally deceptive economic model. To wrap our heads around the German economy at that time, we really have to look at a landmark study published in the Economic History Review by researcher Germain Bell. He uncovered a surprising historical fact that often totally flies under the radar. While the rest of the West was nationalizing to fight the Depression, the Nazis were systematically reprivatizing state-owned firms. The historical documentation actually shows massive state sell-offs between 1934 and 1937. We're talking about the state willingly giving up its shares in major, crucial entities. For instance, the government sold off its block of shares in United Steelworks, which was the second largest joint stock company in all of Germany. They reprivatized major commercial banks, like the Dresdner Bank and Commerzbank, along with shipyards and local public utilities. So you've got to ask, why? Why would a totalitarian, control-obsessed regime just hand over ownership? Well, it wasn't because they loved the free market, that's for sure. It was highly strategic. First, it bought political support. Returning United Steelworks to private hands secured the absolute loyalty of powerful industrialists like Fritz Thyssen. Second, the regime desperately needed immediate financial revenue to fund a massive, unprecedented rearmament program. Selling assets brought in quick cash. Finally, Hitler just wasn't constrained by a strict ideology regarding property. For him, the whole public-private dilemma wasn't important, just as long as he maintained ultimate, unquestioned control. Which brings us to Section 5, Control Without Ownership. This is the real catch behind this massive wave of German reprivatization. How do you relinquish ownership, but keep all the power? Economic historian O. Nathan really hit the nail on the head with this. He pointed out that it was a totalitarian system of government control operating entirely within the framework of private property. Yes, there was private initiative inside the factory doors, but zero private initiative was allowed in the broader market. The traditional freedom of the entrepreneur, to decide what to make, who to sell it to, and for how much, was heavily dictated by the state. Economists Schleifer and Vishny describe this beautifully as a principal-agent dynamic. Basically, an anti-market government actually prefers private ownership, provided they can strictly regulate it. In Nazi Germany, the totalitarian state was the ultimate principle. The private business owners, they were merely the agents. The owners kept the shiny titles to their factories and took on all the business risks. But the state pulled every single string from above through intense regulation, price controls, and political interference. They basically got all the benefits of industrial production without the headache of managing it directly. All right, Section 6, the vending machine illusion. Let's synthesize both the Italian and German models. Despite their different approaches, they actually share a very powerful conceptual metaphor. Even though they used totally different mechanics, both regimes essentially built totalitarian public-private partnerships. Mussolini consolidated power by legally recognizing guilds and then suffocating them, absorbing them directly into his massive bureaucracy. Hitler, on the other hand, consolidated power by selling off state assets to private owners, only to command those owners through an inescapable web of dictatorial regulation. Think of it like a vending machine. We can call this the vending machine illusion. From the outside, a vending machine looks like a totally free transaction, right? You make a choice, you pop a coin in, you get your product. In 1930s Italy and Germany, the regimes presented a brilliant facade of a functioning market, complete with private property, corporate profits, and labor guilds. But when you opened the machine, you saw it was completely rigged. The state owned the machine, stocked the machine, set the prices, and held the keys to the cash box. It was this grand illusion of autonomy masking absolute, suffocating control. And that brings us to the biggest takeaway of this entire explainer. History proves that tyranny doesn't always look like total state ownership. Sometimes it dresses up as a public-private partnership, a corporate guild, or a privatized market heavily burdened by state commands. So if absolute state power can so seamlessly mask itself behind the illusion of private enterprise and corporate autonomy, how do we identify true economic freedom today? What are the strings we aren't seeing? Thanks for exploring this crazy paradox with me. See you next time.